Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the virtual EOC Smart Practices and Future Trends, a state and local perspective presented by Justin Cates and Kevin Kay. Justin joined the mayor's cabinet in August of 2011 after coming from his role as a Homeland Security consultant for the Delaware Emergency Management Agency. In his role, Justin leads the City of Nashua's mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery efforts by coordinating with non-governmental organizations, the private sector, and all levels of government. He is a certified emergency manager affiliated with the International Association of Emergency Managers and is a graduate of the University of Delaware, where he majored in emergency management and public administration. He is currently studying at the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security. Kevin Kay is the Director of State and Local Programs for the National Alliance for Public Safety, GIS, Foundation. He has 10 years of experience implementing technology in emergency management and public safety with a focus on emergency operations centers and multi-jurisdictional and multidisciplinary information sharing. Kevin also coordinates the ad hoc working group on EOC virtualization in coordination with the FEMA National Integration Center Coordination Group. Kevin holds a master's degree from the University of Colorado, Denver in public administration and is a certified Colorado emergency manager. Before we welcome our presenters, let me remind you to make sure you're muted and your video is off. And please put any questions that you have in the chat there in Attendify. We will have time after their presentation for that. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Justin Cates and Kevin Kay. The virtual stage is all yours.
Welcome to the virtual EOC Smart Practices and Future Trends, a state and local perspective. This is an opportunity for us to explain some of the innovative approaches that state and local emergency management agencies have been taking over the last 15 months or so that we've been in COVID-19 to implement virtual emergency operations center solutions. Next slide. What we'll talk about today is a brief background of virtual emergency operations centers from a state and local perspective. We'll review the COVID-19 response and how virtual emergency operations centers played a really significant role during this pretty massive incident. We'll also go through some of the lessons learned and smart practices that were identified by state, local, and private sector entities across the country during this response. And finally, we'll close out by giving you an overview of some of the ongoing initiatives and things that are coming up in the future that may be an opportunity for you to engage in to help build the future of virtual emergency operations. Next slide. So a little bit about my background. I'm Justin Cates, Director of Emergency Management for the City of Nashua, New Hampshire. And I'm a component of the virtual emergency operations subgroup that the FEMA National Integration Center is put on to help build the future of this type of an initiative. And we started off doing some work in this space all the way back to 2011 during Tropical Storm Irene and the 2011 October nor'easter. And the idea was for us to move from paper, very driven processes within our emergency operations center to at least bring everything into a virtual environment for the folks that are sitting there in the room to be able to share information. And that continued to progress up into 2014 through an exercise that we conducted with the Department of Homeland Security called Cause 3, where we started actually integrating social media information into this common operating picture, as well as the use of mobile apps to get people who were out in the field also engaged in that same operating environment. But what was interesting is during the 2020 and 2021 COVID-19 pandemic, we literally shifted our entire emergency operations center to a virtual environment from day one all the way through our demobilization 15 months later. So this is a really interesting and passionate topic. I'm very happy to be here today. I'll turn it over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Justin. Hey, everyone. My name is Kevin Kay, and I am the Director of State and Local Programs for the National Alliance for Public Safety GIS Foundation, or NAPSG Foundation. I spent the majority of my career as a emergency manager, and at the beginning of COVID was the deputy emergency manager for Arapahoe County Office of Emergency Management in Colorado. Even though we'll cover a lot of COVID related challenges and practices today, I think the transformation we saw in the past year and a half was really just the next step in the adoption of technologies in general within emergency management, albeit a much more rapid and visible one to the public and the community. I just wanted to highlight a couple instances like Justin did of the goals and the use of technology that we've seen over the past couple of years. And really, obviously, COVID expedited this. So 2013, 2015 Colorado floods, there was no way to gain situational awareness across the entire state. Using geospatial resources and the technology such as ArcGIS Online really helped get those groups and interoperable data sets together. Unfortunately, a lot of active threats, active shooters have happened in Colorado throughout the past couple of years. And there was really a need for standardized pre-plans to share that information across jurisdictional boundaries. So again, it's just moving data amongst communities with grid reference guides overlaid with common symbology. A wildland fire state as well in Colorado. So using that live imagery to do hazard analysis, damage assessment, really using the drones and the live imagery to create orthomosaic and tile packages, really utilizing geospatial resources you have. And finally, with COVID-19, I think it just brought it to a whole new level with the ability to incorporate whole community partners, regardless of their licensing or technology or ability to use it. And then we'll talk about a lot today, kind of the Office 365, Google Suite, and all the other applications out there. So again, just an evolution of what we've seen as far as technology and emergency management.
So what have we learned during COVID-19? This has been sort of a unique disaster that we've been dealing with, not only from the response that we've taken as emergency managers, but just in the way that we've coordinated with our partners across government, businesses, the nonprofit sector. It's been pretty unbelievable. Next slide. So some of the big concerns with virtual operations during COVID-19 was really the kind of significant shift that we saw mid-event towards virtual operations. Many jurisdictions we found didn't really have an easy ability to completely virtualize their operations in the initial stages of COVID-19. So in most cases, they started off with sort of an initial physical presence within their EOCs using physical distancing and sanitation and things to try and prevent the spread of the coronavirus in that facility. But over time, many organizations started figuring out ways to actually shift people offsite and have them operate from other locations virtually. Certainly, lack of training was another big issue. People, if they're not familiar with the use of a virtual platform for emergency operations, getting them up to speed pretty quickly was definitely a big concern. But many did it, and many did it really well. The other major issue is system interoperability. You hear the term interoperability so frequently in the public safety profession when we think of land mobile radios and dispatch centers and things like that. But this really also plays into now these applications and services that we're using, which we find that many of them don't connect to each other. They don't work well together. And if you've got multiple entities using virtual EOC platforms, how do we ensure that they're all able to share information during a disaster? And then security. I know this was a big area of our concern in Nashua. We found in a lot of cases we were trying to implement solutions that didn't have the best security, mainly because we were trying to do it on the fly. Allowing people to have credentials to systems that we probably on a day-to-day basis wouldn't allow was definitely one of our big areas of concern. So these are some of the things that I think many of us in the state and local community dealt with in those initial stages of the response. Next slide. Some additional challenges that we saw with virtual operations during this response was, certainly security related to unauthorized users gaining access to our systems. I'm hoping that none of you had to deal with the Zoom bombing incident. We were actually lucky enough not to have to deal with that, but I know many who were doing video briefings and conference calls with their partners had dealt with this issue. The operational cadence, one of the things that you'll find in a physical emergency operations center environment is the ability for people to have regular briefings and meetings to keep on track with what types of operational activities are taking place. And if everybody's not in the same room, you still have to have some sort of a schedule to at least keep that cadence moving forward. There was also a refusal to adopt new technologies in a lot of cases. Many of the folks who were very accustomed to working in the physical EOC didn't want to move to a virtual EOC because there was a loss of, uh, of the ability to share information easily in that environment. And we also found IT was sometimes unwilling to move into some of these cloud-based technologies, especially if they had a lot of on-premise solutions that they were familiar with. We know that there's distractions at home. You've got to deal with your kids and potentially your spouse or partner or a number of other people who are there now, literally in your emergency operations center, whether that be your living room or whatever other room you were using. Personal resilience, the concept that are you able to sustain an operation from your home? Thankfully, COVID-19 was an incident that didn't result in significant damage to people's properties, but there was certainly concerns about the ability to maintain a viable internet connection during this response, making sure that you had the ability to get food and other supplies during some sort of a long-term event where you weren't able to go out to the grocery store. So we're considering those issues around the storage and supplies that you would have at an emergency operations center. Do you have that same ability in your home? Recurring costs. The many of these services are license fee based services, so that's certainly a concern as well. Concurrent events. This was a big disaster that we saw. A number of entities which ultimately had, civil unrest or natural hazard related events concurrently happening while we were dealing with COVID. So do you set up separate instances of those solutions for each disaster, or are you all operating on one solution? And then a gap in user experience. We all know that person within our agency who may not be the most familiar with technology solutions. So ultimately, we have to find ways to get them up to speed quickly and move them forward. Next slide, please.
So Justin covered some very specific challenges. I want to cover a handful of overarching themes around kind of operations and guidance gaps. Facility challenges will always be persistent. COVID really uncovered some of the flaws in the planning process, but it wasn't just your agency owned a secondary and backup site that you have control. As he said, you're at home and you sometimes don't have a ton of control over kind of the environment you operate in. The processes for a completely virtual EOC, not just a hybrid, a lot of those were ill-defined in the planning processes out there, as well as that coordinated team actions and decisions. It's much easier when you have an operational tempo within an EOC. You can have your breakout rooms, your planning meetings, your operational meetings. When you're all siloed and you're at disparate locations, it's much harder to do that and make decisions. Training shortfalls, we don't have to harp on that. Whether it's in-person, hybrid, or virtual, there's always going to be some new technology or process that's always difficult, and you just got to find the time to train. And then finally, we tend to operate a lot in these very hierarchical, static systems. So it's really difficult to adjust and adapt to virtual conditions without preparation and testing there. But on top of both kind of the operational and cultural challenges, people that want to or don't want to adopt the technology, there's a guidance challenge and a guidance gap out there. Current guidance barely touches on the complexities of a EOC, and with the ongoing nature of pandemic, there wasn't a chance to really take a tactical pause, take stock of where you were at, and start making changes based on what you've seen to start that AAR process really mid-incident. And that's still happening. It's still a challenge. But it wasn't just authoritative or doctrinal guidance that was lacking. It was also the guidance related to the technologies being used. Who here, if we were in person, I would ask everybody to raise their hands. Who has a planning P hanging in the EOC? I think everyone would raise their hands because we're all emergency managers. How many of you have Office 365 kind of license image or graphic hanging in the EOC of what you're going to assign new people that come in virtually or in a hybrid environment? It was just a change. There wasn't guidance of how you assign these permission levels and what technologies to use where. So we'll cover a bit of that today as well.
So one of the things that we found commonly during COVID-19 was this idea to just deploy off-the-shelf solutions. Many jurisdictions had at least some minimal ability to get a video conferencing solution up and running. Some were actually moved into the cloud environment for most of their Office suite. So they might have had access to Office 365 or Google Workspace. And so those solutions were typically reconfigured and adjusted for the use for virtual emergency operations centers. Now, one of the things that we will also note is that you can commonly group these into three categories. One being the video and audio conferencing solutions, the second being chat and messaging solutions, and then the third being a collaborative Office suite. And we'll talk about why grouping them into those three is really an important thing. Next slide. So there's a theory out there that was developed by Richard Daft and Robert Lingle called the media richness theory. And essentially the idea behind this is that various levels of communication, various mediums of communication provide a richer, more immersive experience when trying to transfer information, particularly information that requires decisions to be made, and acknowledge it and ensure that the other person understands and is able to take action. So you can see here in this slide, the variety of mediums kind of vary across whether they're more rich, which would be a face-to-face conversation, versus unaddressed documents like mail, which are not very rich at all and are a very lean medium. And this aligns very closely with how we organize our virtual EOC platforms. Next slide. You'll see that video and audio conferencing applications are some of the better and more rich, media-rich tools that we can use to kind of replicate that virtual or that physical emergency operations center environment. Chat and messaging applications, a little less because we don't have that face-to-face interaction. We're not able to see the sort of the context clues and things that we would have as a face-to-face conversation. And then finally, those Office suite applications. Those present the most challenges because those documents a lot of times might be in a shared file folder somewhere. We don't really know who's intended for each, but we found that many of these platforms like Office 365 and Google Workspace are integrating functionality and features to really raise the media richness of those. So you're able to tag people so that they're alerted that there's been a change in a document, or that there's a need for action, maybe a signature or something else. So we're seeing these solutions improve, and we've seen a lot of improvement over COVID-19. Next slide. One of the things we also found was, for those jurisdictions that were already using Google Workspace or Office 365, they found a number of new use cases of those platforms for emergency management use. They were able to do incident management staff video briefings as a replication of the physical briefings that they would do in person at their EOC. Video breakout rooms for those task forces that would be created to deal with a specific problem. Or chat channels that would be dedicated to specific operational functions. For example, in Nashua, we had a chat group that was set up for our vaccination clinics. We had another that was set up for our safety office. We had another that was set up for resource management. It allowed us to group those conversations and information so that it didn't overload everybody. We also had collaborative incident action plans, people working on collaborative documents so that there was no email back and forth of documents trying to figure out which one is the most recent document. So that was a big improvement over this response. Having shared file repositories, not only within the EOC, but for those mobile users and other folks that were working around the city to be able to access those from wherever they were. We also implemented online forums for resource requests so that people could request durable medical equipment or consumable medical supplies in real time. And that was a really helpful solution. We were able to build those forms in a matter of moments. So that was a huge, huge improvement. And then we had access controlled web portals. We saw many jurisdictions around the country implementing those types of solutions so that people could have a password protected cloud-based environment to go to get access to the chat, the file repository, and all of that. And then we're also seeing a lot of automation applications. So things like Power BI or some of these workflow tools that allow you to essentially take an action in one application, maybe in your Slack or Microsoft Teams, and then it allows that notification to go to another spot or maybe populates a document. So there's some really neat applications that I think are coming forward in that space as well. Next slide. The key that we want you to understand when we talk about the term virtual emergency operations center is that there's a variety of platforms that we've been familiar with for many, many years in this space, whether it be Web EOC or VOC or any of those other tools that are out there meant to help emergency management organizations and their stakeholders to share and track information. But we saw a lot of difference in COVID-19. It wasn't just about using those forms and databases that we find in our typical virtual emergency operations center platforms. There was a need to replicate the functions and abilities that we see within a physical emergency operations center. And that's where these collaborative tools like Office 365 and Google Workspace, Slack, and Zoom really came into play here. The closest analogs to those traditional platforms are things like messaging tools and file storage, but those tools don't provide that immersive experience that is really necessary to replicate a physical EOC. Now, as we move forward, I think we will see some changes here as well, where tools like Airtable or Google Tables, which are cloud-based database platforms that are very intuitive and easy for you to use, I think they might end up replacing some of these other platforms as well over time. So it's something to keep in mind as you move forward. Next slide.
Great. So a lot of what we covered, I'm sure you all experienced in one way or another. Very challenging incident, as always. Kind of the emergency management community rises to the challenge, rapidly innovates, but it's been hard to kind of capture those case studies and best practices. So in an effort to do that, at the annual NAPSIG event, the Innovation Summit for Preparedness and Resilience, we wanted to try to capture the tools and technologies, workflows, challenges, and ultimately best practices from emergency management practitioners across the country. Just so everyone knows, the interview and materials are still available. In the next few slides, Justin and I won't take a ton of ownership over as far as the best practices. These are your peers out there and what they found as continuing challenges, but also a handful of best challenges out there as well. So one of the biggest issues by far was this ecosystem problem, especially organizations that already used multiple ecosystems, and whether that was because budgetary reasons or just what you were more comfortable with. It's unrealistic to think that a single platform can do everything, but it is ideal when possible to stay within the same ecosystem. So think of native support for Word, Excel, and PowerPoint that's now integrated into Teams. Once you kind of choose that ecosystem, then you have the ability to customize. Nothing off the shelf, as Justin mentioned, is going to work 100%. Cassandra in one of the videos talks a lot about making the typical ICS forms work for your organization. And we've seen people do that in the past, but it's easier now with these technologies. You could just rapidly change. There's also a lot of project management functions. That's what a lot of these tools are built for. Leverage that as emergency managers. They're there to kind of get a structure in place, but also help you automate and get to whatever your goal and objective is quicker. With that, you could templatize, and whether you determine that you're going to templatize per incident or per function, it doesn't really matter. If you want to stand up for every hurricane a new set of teams and channels and lists, that's fine. Just whatever works for your organization. But ultimately, it can't just be the emergency managers who invest in this system. We at Arapahoe County were using Teams a lot even before COVID, but no one else really used it. And once the sheriff's office determined that they could use Teams to do in-service training because of COVID social distancing measures, they loved it and they jumped on it and they started using it for everything, to sharing training files, to, again, conducting that in-service training. At the same time, this idea of haves and have-nots does not go away. Just remember that as you work with your state and locals. The rural jurisdiction that before didn't have a physical EOC, or it was a temporary space, versus your large city with a multi-million-dollar facility and 20 staff, the same issues apply with the technology being used for virtual EOCs. Your rural district may not even have a consistent internet line. They may not have the newest smartphone or laptops or hotspots, whereas your large jurisdictions will. They might have dedicated fiber lines and backups and brand new phones and computers. And ultimately, kind of this virtual etiquette is still being developed as well. Do you get dressed in business casual in EOC? Do you have a uniform? Do you send out agendas beforehand? Or is it because of the flexibility of the system, you just spin up a meeting and people are just there? So that's still being developed. I think everyone could kind of agree with that. One of the other big ideas is the, licensing issue. What level are you? I don't think anybody that we met and we worked with could say that I was a, license level 1, 2, or 3 in Office 365. What does that mean? Do you have access to Power Automate or Power BI, Adobe Pro? What's your process for getting upgraded in those accounts? What capability and modules do you already have that can be adapted to virtual EOC environments? Hal Grieve from Jefferson County, Colorado, talked about their use of Monday.com. That wasn't even in the emergency management office. It was used for other items. And they said, hey, we could use this for a virtual EOC. So one of the big items to take away was determine what sort of license you have, enterprise versus standard. The government version of Teams, for example, does not have the same functionality as the public version, and things are rolled out slower. So make sure you keep your finger on the pulse of the roadmaps that they constantly push out. And then finally, the working from home and virtual challenges. This idea that remote or virtual work means working from home, well, that's not necessarily the case. We found that a lot of users are comfortable being at their office, but not in the EOC now, and that makes them better and more effective at their job because that's what they're comfortable with. But the operational tempo and monitoring levels need to be adjusted accordingly. Just because I can log into my computer at all hours of the night because I don't have to drive 30 minutes to an EOC doesn't mean that we should have meetings all hours of the night. And finally, taking the opportunity to streamline and implement changes as you go. You don't have to necessarily do a one-to-one. What you do in a physical EOC is what you now do in a virtual environment. The EOC and hybrid, the virtual EOC hybrid is not a continuity plan and it's not going away. So you need to kind of determine where your efficiencies can be found and just start working on those right away. Most of these technologies are not designed for this use. So be comfortable being uncomfortable. How many of you can say we have a workflow, it's working great, and then the very next day an update is pushed and everything breaks? That always happens, and you're just gonna have to get used to it kind of with these technologies until people start understanding it's being used for kind of critical operations. I really want to highlight this idea that IT staff are not help desk staff. There's kind of this idea that IT is there to reset passwords or to get new licenses, and that is not the case. Leveraging IT staff and your current technologies and licenses was one of the most important pieces of cooperation that we did during COVID-19 response and operations. Their ability to look and say, yes, I can use the technology for this, or no, I can't, was super helpful in starting to leverage what we actually owned. And then finally, leverage these technologies for better interaction with the public. It's more open, it's more flexible. You need this two-way communication with the public, and it makes it really easy to have specific pieces of information that aren't sensitive pushed out to the public pretty easily just by checking a couple boxes. So make sure that you're leveraging that with the public as well.
So some other smart practices and lessons learned that we found, shift changes in a physical EOC a lot easier because it's very obvious when the shift change occurs and new employees or staff members are coming in. So Rob from New York City had talked about some of the strategies that they used in ensuring that there's strict procedures as to how that shift change occurs in a virtual environment, making sure that you understand, what types of capabilities your partners have. So do some of those folks that are within your agency have access to Tableau or ArcGIS Online, whatever the other sort of specialized tools, cloud-based tools might be out there? And the same goes for your outside partners as well. Do they have access or credentials on those systems if you're going to be using them? It's also been identified it's easier to get specialized technical staff when it's virtual. These subject matter experts might not be available to sit there in your EOC all day, but in a virtual environment, they can monitor all day, or you can request them to jump on a call pretty quickly. One of the other things that was interesting from the New York City case was this concept of having an open line. So in their physical EOC, they have microphones at each one of the workstations where anybody at any point can open that mic up and ask a question to the entire EOC or raise a concern. Well, when you're in a virtual environment, that's not easy. So what they did is they set up a channel that was an audio channel that served in that same kind of role during the virtual environment. So consider what things you want to try and replicate from your physical environment. And the other nice thing about a virtual environment is you can build that EOC out as you're dealing with the incident. So one of the things we did in Nashua was we built out those channels on Slack as we needed them. We didn't start off automatically with 100 different channels for people to join. So as we needed or reorganized our incident command structure, we were able to shift our tools as well. The other thing is signing in is another concern when you're trying to deal with a virtual environment. Who's on shift? It's sometimes easier when you're in a physical environment because there's literally a workstation that you go up to, you fill out a piece of paper and say that you're now checked in. But you need to consider how you're going to do that in a virtual environment as well. And then, as we've discussed earlier, interoperability is a real concern when you're dealing with multiple entities and multiple platforms that people are operating off of. So you need to think about those approaches and where information is going to be shared at when you have multiple systems to use. Next slide. VPN, virtual private network, is something of concern, especially if you're using secure systems. And one of the things that we've found is if it's possible at all to have cloud-based solutions with multi-factor authentication, you're going to find yourself in a much easier situation than trying to provide custom access to an on-premise solution that requires network access. So definitely consider how your operation works in that case. Making sure that moving forward, while we recognize the importance of virtual EOCs in COVID-19, we need to train on this moving forward and have regular exercises and tests using this type of environment as well. And now we've got to remember that we've got all these other players that are sitting here nearby our virtual EOC, whether it be our kids, our pets, and all the other activities that are taking place during an incident. So that should be also considered in your training program as well. Inclusivity is another neat part of virtual EOCs because we were able to bring in so many new stakeholders into our EOC, sharing information with them and keeping them up to date that we would have never been able to do in the past. And one of the interesting cases from Walmart that we did during the Inspire session was understanding how they used it on a global footprint to see what types of issues were being dealt with in their markets outside of the U.S. and knowing those things were going to be problems in the U.S. when they arrived. Knowing how to keep your span of control organized within a virtual EOC is tough because it's a lot easier with that sort of asynchronous type of environment to really burden yourself with so many people that are working for you versus a physical environment where you're more stringent with your span of control. And hybrid is the future. I think we will see environments where physical EOC does make sense, but I think we'll also see a number of cases where we'll probably shift to virtual just because of the amount of resources that are necessary to set up a physical EOC. Next slide.
Great. So that was a lot of info, a lot of challenges, a lot of best practices. We're definitely not 100% there. So there are ongoing initiatives and next steps that we want everyone to be aware of. And if you would like to contribute, please let us know. So there's the NIC Coordination Group, or NCG Coordination Group. And so it's a group of stakeholders that looks at the implementation of NIMS, which we're all super familiar with. And Justin and myself, along with a lot of your peers, are on the subgroup for technology. And that really looks at how technology is utilized within kind of the NIMS structure. We've looked at mutual aid technologies in the past. We looked at roles for IT, communications, and cybersecurity personnel within EOC and their job positions and responsibilities. And then now we're looking at this ad hoc, this virtualization piece that's just come about. So throughout multiple meetings and in coordination with the NIC out of FEMA, we determined that there was this huge need for development of guidance on technology approaches to virtualizing EOC. So Justin will walk us through, kind of what our plan is to look at that.
So one of the resources that we started off with when putting this program on was this EOC how-to quick reference guide. And what we thought that we would do as part of the virtualization effort is basically use that same framework to start off with and actually compare the virtual considerations and criteria with what's needed for a physical EOC. So as an example, you'll see on the slide, sort of the high level categories that we're going to cover. And as an example, you might, in the planning, training, and exercise section, talk about the differences in virtualization, where you might consider how to run a virtual tabletop exercise for your EOC. You might talk about on the resource management side, how to do resource management through virtual workflows versus having physical forms within your EOC. So this is an exciting way for us to try and connect the physical EOC environment and guidance with our proposed virtual EOC guidance. And we'll hope that you'll help us to contribute to this as well. Next slide. So this is our timeline. We've been working with this ad hoc group for a number of months now and have started to build out that virtual framework. And what we hope to do is in the August timeframe to put out sort of a draft of our virtual guidance. And there are going to be opportunities for you to contribute and provide some recommendations or smart practices that you found within your operation as well. Next slide. So to kind of close this out here, one of the things that we want you to think about is, from your operations over COVID-19 or even prior to that, how did you use virtual emergency operations centers? And ultimately, what do you want other colleagues of yours to know about that you think would help them in future disasters? This is our contact information. We'll hope that you reach out to us and are interested in maybe participating in our ad hoc group or providing contributions to our virtual EOC efforts. And I think we'll be looking to answer some of your questions during this session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Justin and Kevin, for that great presentation. We do have a couple of questions. I'd like to open with the first one, which I actually am particularly interested in hearing the answer to. It says, what current emerging technology will have the greatest impact on virtual EOCs?
Well, I think from my perspective, the most significant emerging technology is really these collaborative online cloud-based services. So you think back to historically how we've used software in emergency operations centers. They've been installed on computers and they require pretty significant and complicated networking to really make a difference. Now it's as easy as going to a website, and now you've got some really interesting tools at your fingertips. So I think that's the most significant moving forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would say less on the kind of software side and more on the hardware side, the ability to have cloud computing. Windows just announced Windows 365, the ability to access your desktop and all of your applications exactly where you were at on any device, really shifts kind of the need to have physical spaces and physical devices that are capable of running all of these applications and situational awareness platforms, pretty much for anyone, anywhere, anytime.
Great. We have another question. What do you think the future of virtual EOCs looks like?
Well, for me, I think one of the areas that has not really been explored during COVID, because I think it's going to require some more work beyond just throwing something together like what we did during COVID, is kind of virtual reality, being able to sort of operate in a sort of an immersive environment with your colleagues, sort of in this virtual space. And I have seen some examples of this being done. I know the National Institute of Standards and Technology has been pushing out some tools with some of their partners on these virtual environments for emergency operations and incident management. Still very much in the beta testing area, but really some interesting opportunities in the future where we might even feel like we're in a physical EOC, but doing it virtually.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that you really don't see a difference between day-to-day operations and EOC activities in the future. You don't physically move a space into a different room, different hardware and software. The same applications you're using, whether it be Teams or Slack or Monday.com, any of the ones we kind of discussed in our presentation, is just used for everything outside of emergency operations. And then the transition is just seamless. And whether that's jumping to a different channel or a different workspace, it's a lot less training and it's a lot less maintenance. Everything's kind of consolidated in one place. And I think the power is there and the technology can support that.
Great. Let's take one more. And if you have other questions, their information, Justin and Kevin's both, is on the Attendify platform. But one more question before we close. How will staffing and/or positions change based on a virtual environment?
Well, I think, one way that this might shift in the future is really around the transition between normal operations and emergency operations. We historically, especially in smaller jurisdictions or smaller organizations where they don't have dedicated emergency operations staff, there's sort of this collateral duty of every person involved in that organization to be able to kind of come together during an incident and operate either out of a physical EOC or a virtual EOC. So with virtual EOCs, I think the opportunity is now everybody in that organization or in that jurisdiction has the opportunity to essentially sit in the EOC. So they're able to now operate, with their colleagues, regardless of how essential their role is in emergency operations. So I think the biggest change is we're going to see more people involved in incident management, and there's going to be a need for more control and coordination as to how they're going to engage with their colleagues during an incident.
And I think you'll start to see more experienced folks participating in the EOC, as well as more specialized skills participating in EOC. The people that typically maybe have a very minor role, and maybe it's in the planning process during hazard mitigation, or maybe it's long way down the road in recovery, can easily just plug in, especially kind of on the geospatial side, the technology side. But you're no longer bounded by physical boundaries. Justin and I have talked about it before. Maybe it's a hazard that impacts your jurisdiction or an entire area of the country, but not the East Coast. And can you pull in emergency management staff that know your planning processes, know your logistics processes, and just seamlessly integrate them into whatever you're using? That really enables you to tap expertise within the emergency management community much greater than just your local jurisdiction. So I think staffing will definitely expand and especially allow those rural jurisdictions or small jurisdictions that don't have the staff and don't have the technology and the space to really bolster kind of their emergency operations in general.
Wonderful. We do have a few more minutes, and the questions are starting to come in hot and heavy now. Michelle Baker asked, and I think this is a good lead in, any advice for helping EOC members who are reluctant to use virtual EOCs? Have you found ways to convince people that it's effective?
Well, I think the number one way that we were able to convince folks to jump on this platform, because we saw resistance as well when we shifted into this environment, were really two big things. Number one, you can do it from home. I think people really in this very uncertain environment, they wanted to have the option to be able to stay at home and be able to deal with the kids and caregiving for family members and all the other things, responsibilities on their plate, but still be heavily engaged in the incident management process. So that was one big one. The second one was really the mobile accessibility, being able to do it from anywhere. So one of the historical problems we've had at the EOC, physical EOC, is we've got some key decision makers who don't want to sit there. They don't want to be there in that one room because they want the ability to be able to go back to their offices. They want to be able to go out to the field. So having the ability to do any of this stuff from their mobile device was, I think, a big seller.
Yeah, and I think the resistance can be overcome, as we mentioned, using it day to day. I think one of our examples was the sheriff's office not really wanting to jump in and use Teams. And once they realized they could use it for in-service training, they could have a single instructor in a room and you could still meet the requirements for your accreditation or for your in-service training. And people start realizing they can use it every single day, whether it's just chatting amongst teams or actually knocking out training, then they'll be able to use it in an emergency environment for sure.
Thank you. The next one, I know we only have 2 minutes, but Thomas Anciso asked, any discussions on maintaining classification controls? And if this will be used in the DOE, classification controls would be beneficial to add to the discussion.
Well, this is commonly an area that's really outside of the scope of state and local emergency managers, but I do think that this has come up to some extent around the types of information, particularly public health information, PII. There does need to be a discussion as part of this virtualization effort on sensitive information and how that's going to be controlled in really everybody's living room. So it's definitely something that needs to be discussed, but it's outside of the purview of some of the work we've done.
Yeah, and I would just say we looked at that, especially on the public safety sensitive CGIS information law enforcement side. And there's some powerful tools that could help you overcome that, and whether it's permissions based or power automation that prevents certain people from accessing the information, and a lot of checks and balances along the way. Private channels are just like a minimal part of it. You're really talking about how you store it, how you destroy it, how you make sure that everything's maintained. So it's a valid point, and I think you'll see that across pretty much any discipline, public health especially, but also law enforcement and Department of Energy.
Again, thank you so much for your presentation. I love seeing the large attendance, and I know there's going to be more questions. Remember, for those of you that are attending, to fill out your survey so that you can get credit for this. And I hope that you will stay on and enjoy some more wonderful presentations. Thank you again, Kevin and Justin.
Thank you
so much.